To other news now, and there are huge conversations underway around the world around how artificial intelligence could make a difference in how we treat people with certain medicines. There are now concerns that the way these drugs are being developed means they may not properly treat people from our continent. There's a lot of research into what is called pharmacogenomics. In other words, drugs that react differently to people based on their genes. What may help one person could impact another person differently because they have different genes. Professor Kelly Chibale is a professor of organic chemistry at the University of Cape Town, also holds the Neville Isdell Chair in African-centric drug discovery and development. Professor, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. So at this moment, most of the research on these drugs is being done, I presume, in North America and Europe. What does that mean for us here in Africa?
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me on the show, and good afternoon to you and to the viewers. Yeah, so the current status quo is that historically medicines have not been optimized on the African patient population or for the African patient population. And of course, there's a couple of reasons for this. One reason is that we have a very low volume of clinical trials that happen on the African continent. As I'm sure you can appreciate, Stephen, medicines or vaccines, are optimized in terms of the dosages, or dosing regimens, or the frequency of dosing on people that participate in those clinical trials. So unfortunately, although there has been progress in terms of the number of clinical trials that happen on the African continent, there's less than 5%, between 3 and 4% of clinical trials happen, which means that this huge genetic diversity that we have on the African continent and really is not well accounted for in this process. And so we've got to address this either by increasing the number of clinical trials that happen on the continent and the number of Africans participating in those clinical trials. There is also another aspect on the discovery part of the process, which is that the available tools and models do not really account for this huge genetic diversity that's on the African continent. Africa is arguably the most genetically diverse continent on this planet.
It's interesting because that's a really important point. I've seen and I've spoken to people before who work in your field, geneticists, who tell us that Africa has much more genetic diversity than any other place. And almost as an accident of economics, the danger must be that people are at risk of carrying out bad science by looking for, I suppose, the group of people with the smallest genetic diversity in Europe and North America and doing their tests just simply in the wrong place.
Yeah, I think this is, when I think about life in general, I think, actually everybody's an African. Everybody came from Africa if you look at the history of humanity. And so I would even argue that every clinical trial actually has to start in Africa because the world can really benefit from this huge genetic diversity that we have on our continent. And I think that we also have to understand and take responsibility as Africans, to understand what are the factors that have led to this status quo. Why do we not have enough clinical trials? And I think there are a number of reasons that I can really get into, but maybe just to mention a couple or so is, first of all, in some countries, whether it's in China or Japan, there is a requirement that before you approve a particular medicine or vaccine in that country, there is a requirement for you to test that medicine or vaccine on that population. So I think in Africa, at the policy level, there's got to be a requirement in every country on this continent to require that any medicine or vaccine that is going to be approved or licensed for use in these countries has to be tested on the local population. So that's the first one. I think it's going to be a policy requirement on the part of governments. But the other thing is, which of course is very encouraging, that we now have the formation of the African Medicines Agency. Why this is important, that is we're going to standardize all the regulatory requirements. We're going to harmonize the environment in terms of how we conduct clinical trials, that we play to the same standards, rules, and policies, and also that we don't need to require every person that wants to do a clinical trial to get approval in every single country. That just adds to the time it takes. It makes clinical trials more expensive. So there are things that we can do as Africans to take the lead in addressing this particular challenge by, for example, changing policies that require clinical trials to be done here. But also, a third thing that is important is that we really, really, really need to participate in clinical trials. Our communities and our people, we all need to understand that participating in a clinical trial is in our best interest.
Is research in this area moving quite quickly, the idea of developing drugs through the genetic material of the people who will use them? I mean, I presume this could be a real game changer in how we take drugs.
Yeah, Stephen, I think globally, this has been, I think, a game changer. The field, people are calling it precision medicine. You cater for different populations. We can deal with different patient populations, whether it's children, whether it's pregnant women, whether it's adults, or in this case, the field is looking at what is the genetic makeup of a particular population. And I think we're seeing this already as a requirement by regulators like the US FDA that are now requiring that for a product they consider for approval, that there's got to be data on different ethnicities. But also we're beginning to see movements on the part of the innovative pharmaceutical industry, really getting involved in trying to understand what is the impact of genetics of a population and the response to medicines. So one of the example I can give you is the Project Africa Gradient, which is a program by two pharmaceutical companies, GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, and Novartis, in partnership with the South African Medical Research Council, beginning to understand this pharmacogenomics landscape on the African continent so that we can really begin to understand whether people have been underdosed or overdosed. So we factor in the genetics of this population. And there's a worldwide global movement that is really shaping the future of medicine. But I think that we are lagging behind in Africa. And I think it's time that we really played catch up.
Professor, I mean, it would seem to me there's an obvious opportunity here. I mean, if you go into Gauteng, for example, and you walk around Gauteng, you'll see people from almost every single part of the world. You'll see people from Southern Africa, you'll see people from Africa, from Central Africa, from North Africa. You'll see people from Europe, you'll see people who have roots in Europe, people who have roots in China. I mean, there's surely an opportunity here. Testing can't be that expensive. The way the currency works, there may be an opportunity for someone to do a lot more testing in a place like Gauteng, for argument's sake, than in almost any other part in the world.
Absolutely. This is exactly the opportunity that we have over here. But the question is, what are the current policies? What are the current requirements, for people to, what are the ethical policies, the ethical guidelines that are required, for us to be able to do this? For example, when we are doing clinical trials, can we add a component of pharmacogenomic testing so that samples who participate in clinical trials can also be what we call, they can be genotyped. In other words, we can understand what is the genetic makeup so that when you are monitoring response to a particular medicine during a clinical trial, we can see whether somebody is metabolizing the medicines much faster than another person who's metabolizing the medicine much slower, et cetera, et cetera. And these have implications on not just the outcome or the response to the therapy in terms of efficacy, but also adverse reactions. And so this is exactly why we have to really add a component of pharmacogenomic testing as part of routine clinical trials, but also so that our clinicians, our doctors, can really look at thinking about how they can prescribe the optimal medication based on the genetic information of a person. But we need to understand, what do we need to really, really do? And I think it's really building what are known as biobanks. And so this is where, samples of, DNA samples of people that contribute these samples that can be analyzed at a genomic level. This is what is happening already in the UK, in the US, where they have a biobank. But those biobanks, don't really comprise sufficient data from people of African heritage. And I think that's going to be an important component of addressing this issue here. But the question is, how can we currently leapfrog this issue? Because we don't yet have mechanisms to collect data and to share data on a continental scale. Yes. There are some wonderful initiatives that are already happening, which have developed ways of working with communities in a very ethical way and sharing data. But how do we provide access that will allow, for example, technologies like artificial intelligence, to really help us leapfrog this?
Professor, thank you so much. Professor Kelly Chibale, Professor of Organic Chemistry at UCT, and also holds the Neville Isdell Chair in African-Centric Drug Discovery and Development.